When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers! Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello and welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. My name is Scott Speed and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 10 of Race Haven and the title of today's show is American History Unfiltered, Too Raw for Textbooks, Volume 2 with Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson is currently an assistant professor of history at Hunter College, CUNY in New York. She received her undergraduate degree in journalism from Howard University and her Ph.D. in history from Columbia University. Her research interests are abolitionism, slavery and emancipation, violence and political discourse, historical film, Black women's history, and 19th and 20th century African American history. Kellie has been the recipient of numerous awards for her academic research and teaching, including the Harvard University Certificate of Distinction in Teaching in 2014. Kellie has presented part of her work at the University of Cambridge, Yale University, and in Johannesburg, South Africa. So I'm really excited to have join us for today's episode of Race Haven, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. How are you doing today, Dr. Jackson?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, I thank you so much for making time in your schedule to join us. I'm really excited about the ground that we're going to cover today. I'm sure it's going to be really exciting. And just to let our listeners know, I like to let everyone know how I, was able to attract our guests to the show each week. And I first heard Dr. Jackson on another podcast called The Mental Dialogue show with one of our Race Haven contributors, Montoya Smith. And I was really impressed with, her ability to articulate, how the past impacts today. And I actually called in and had a few questions for her during that show. Immediately after the show, I asked Montoya how I can get in touch with her because I thought she would be a great fit for Race Haven. So here we are. We've been communicating for the last couple of weeks, actually for the probably the last month or so, preparing for this show. So again, I'm really excited to have you on. And before we start, just tell me, what do you prefer? Dr. Jackson, Dr. Kellie, what do you prefer?
Kellie is fine. Kellie is fine.
All right.
I know
cool.
my name is pretty long, so.
And it's a trend. It's funny because we had on our last episode in this series of Too Raw for Textbooks, we had another doctor with 3 names. So I find that very interesting. I'm wondering if that's like a thing. Yeah, is that a thing? Like when you're a doctor, you have to have 3 names?
I guess. It just seems to flow for me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we'll go with it. We'll see if the trend will continue. And just to start, we'll jump right into it. Kellie, I want to ask you, because this is a show dealing in race, I want to ask you, what is your ethnicity and where did you grow up?
Sure. So I am African American. I identify as African American or Black American or Black. I see them all as synonymous. I am sort of a nomad, so I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and then shortly after I was born, we moved to the suburbs of Chicago, and then when I was about 12, we moved again to rural Illinois, and then we moved again to about Texas. I did my last 2 years of high school in College Station, Texas. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard. But I've moved a lot of different places. I think about every 4 years I've been in a different state. So I lived in California, in North Dakota, in Spokane, Washington, in Boston, Massachusetts, and now New York. So I think I've hit all 4 corners of the country.
Wow, you're a true American. You are a true American. You've literally experienced all corners of the country. That's awesome, and that informs your perspective greatly, I'm sure. Which leads me into my next question. So, how did your upbringing impact your views on race in America?
Well, I think it's interesting. So I grew up in a big family. I am number 6 of 7 children. And so when my most formative years were spent in the suburbs of Chicago in a place called Deerfield, where I grew up in a predominantly white, majority Jewish neighborhood, I would say, where we were sort of the only black children in the schools. I mean, the other children were my siblings. So there were 1 or 2 or maybe 3 other black families, but it was really, really hard for us to see other black kids outside of church or maybe like scheduled play dates, things of that nature. So I grew up sort of having this duality or this double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about all the time, where you see yourself in one world, in this very white world, and then you see yourself for who you are and within your home, within your family, among your friends. And I felt like those 2 worlds were always at odds, which is one of the reasons why when I graduated high school, I really wanted to attend a HBCU. I really wanted to be at a school where I saw people on a daily basis that looked like me, that had goals like me, that had similar backgrounds to me, and a place where I could be affirmed in my blackness and who I was and what it meant to be a young black woman. So for me, Howard was the best institution for that. I feel like I got all of the affirmation that I needed through my professors, the classes that I was taking, and then also just being in Washington, D.C., which was, at the time, Chocolate City. So there was no better place to sort of get an education in our nation's capital. But everything about my upbringing and where I've lived has really influenced the way that I think about race and racism. My mother is also a professor, so I traveled a lot with her, going to conferences or going to particular events. And so at a very young age, I think I was also thinking about these ideas probably earlier than most typical children are. My mom would give me historical books, tell me, to analyze this book. What do you think is going to happen? Why do you think this is happening? Why do you think this is happening? So I'm constantly, even at the age of like 8 or 7, thinking about these really big ideas. So I may not have been able to articulate them, but I remember being in the 6th grade and reading Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, and the book's 1,000 pages. It took me several months to read, and I'm not exactly sure that I understood what I was reading, but the fact that I was so engaged in the topic of slavery and these ideas have never really left me.
Interesting. So a couple of things. I first wanted to say, shout out to Howard University and all the alum, because I have several friends and contributors to this podcast and listeners who I know attended Howard. And when you said how Howard University affirmed you, it reminded me of a book that I recently completed, which is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Have you read that book or heard of that book?
I've read parts of it. I haven't finished it yet, but I've read parts of it. It's beautiful.
Oh, it's so beautiful and so powerful. And as myself, I grew up in inner city Philadelphia, and Howard wasn't too far, but just and us also wasn't too far from Baltimore, where he was from. So the stories that he told, it literally felt like he was taking me back, to my childhood. So it was just fascinating, and I encourage all of our listeners to pick up that book. No matter your ethnicity or nationality, I think that book would be a great read to give you some insight into the African American experience, inner city African American experience. So with that being said, I also want to ask
Howard too. I should say that.
I'm sorry. Say it again.
Coates attended Howard as well, so that's pretty cool.
Oh yes, absolutely, and that's why I brought it up, because I knew he attended Howard. So, and the other thing I wanted to ask you, so it's interesting, and you kind of answered it a little bit because I was going to ask, with your upbringing and growing up in these majority European American communities. Oh, and actually, I'll go there first. So I'm on this kick of using the term European American to describe quote unquote white people, and the reason why is because just over the years, I've done some research on, the whole idea that race is a social construct, and the whole idea that the lines that were drawn between quote unquote white people and quote unquote black people, et cetera, and other minorities, especially in America, was done to support, white supremacy ideals. And then also just my critical mind and logic started to kick in. And I said, you know what? I've never seen a quote unquote white person before. Like, I've never seen anyone the color of paper, and I've never seen a black person. I've seen very dark hued people of African descent, but I've never seen anyone black. So why do we call people something that they are not? In addition to that, when you call someone white, it doesn't tell anything about them. It says nothing about them, about their heritage, their ethnicity. There's so many, cultural origins and ethnic origins to what it means to be quote unquote white. And also throughout history, that's been a moving target in terms of who's been accepted into that term, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So throughout this podcast, you'll hear me use the term European American in place of white. And the last reason I'll say is this, because I feel like also, it's more intellectually honest to, if I'm African American, and my other friends who are Mexican American or Indian American or Chinese American, if we are our original ethnic background American, then aren't quote unquote white people European American? And if I know that you're Italian or German, I'll give you that as well. I'll say, my Italian American friend, etc. So this is like a little thing that I'm on, and I'm kind of putting out there. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've probably read some of the same articles that you have read about this. And the main one that I can think of is Barbara Field's article on race and racism ideology in the United States, and she refers to white Americans as Euro-Americans or European Americans, and black people as Afro-Americans. And I think to some extent within my scholarship, I've adapted that language as well, but I also very frequently use white American and black American. I think that seems to have been the easiest way to sort of speak with efficiency. Sometimes it's clunkier to say European American, but and because people so readily understand oftentimes when you say white or black. But it's interesting to me because I remember talking to my husband one time, and I said something about, he asked about someone, and I said, yeah, they're Black American, and he said, what is that? And I said, they're a black person from America, and he was like, then just say they're black. Just say they're black. Like, no, it's not that easy. They could be from Jamaica. They could be from Haiti. They could be from Nigeria. Like, using that specification for me is a way to identify black people who live within the United States or black people who live within Latin America. Like, all of that has to be specified so that we don't get caught up in this sloppy language, and so that we don't use language to really reinforce hierarchy and racism and the construction of race. Yes.
And that's why the last point was that, I wanted to make on that is that I believe by saying European American, it levels the playing field. It levels the playing field. I mean, and I believe language is so important. And I actually want to do a show on that because language is important. And, if you can speak change into existence, and by saying that someone is European American or Irish American or whatever, it puts them on equal playing ground versus this historical, hierarchy of white is everything. Our whole, our whole, racial hierarchy in this country has been built on the concept of not white and non-white. And, even down to the whole thing of, white means good and black means bad across so many different, social elements, and ways of speaking and stereotypes and, the white hat versus the black hat and all these different things. White means good and black means bad. And that's been played on by white supremacists throughout our history as well.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
For all of these reasons, whenever I get a platform, I like to share this mindset, and this it's not even a mindset, it's really just fact, and try to encourage. I don't want to say encourage, it's just kind of me putting it out there, and hopefully they catch on.
But make people aware. I think it's very easy to be unaware to the language that we use, or to have it sort of in our subconscious where we don't think about it that much, but we still employ that same kind of language. And I think that's a really good point.
All right, I'll get off of that for now, but thank you. Thank you for engaging me on that a little bit. So the next thing I wanted to ask you was, with your upbringing around European Americans, how soon, or how early in your life did you become aware that you were, quote unquote, different? Did you notice that growing up, or did you feel like did you feel normal? Did you feel like you blended into your community, or did you feel different?
I definitely at times felt different when other people pointed out the differences. But I think as a kid, my parents did a really good job of giving me a good sense of self. And so, because I'm not just African American, I'm also chocolate skin. I prefer to say chocolate. I like the euphemism. But I have a darker skin tone. And I don't remember this, but my mother says that when I was about 3 years old, she had put me in ice skating lessons, and I was the only black girl taking ice skating lessons. I only remember it because I've seen pictures. But there was a moment where all of the girls were standing on the ice, and I said, "Oh, look, you're all staring at me. You're all looking at me. It's because I'm so pretty. It's because I look so cute. Oh, don't you love the way I look?" And my mom was shocked because she was like, "Wow, we've done a good job with her." Like, she has not internalized that these little girls are staring at her because she's the only black girl. But she sees herself as being looked upon because she's cute, because she's pretty, because her chocolate skin enhances who she is. So I've always sort of had that operating in my subconscious, so that even when this was like in probably the first grade, I colored a princess, and I gave her blonde hair and blue eyes and peach skin, and I brought the picture to my mother, and I said, "Look, I colored this princess. Do you like her?" And my mom said, "No, she's ugly." She was like, "Paint her black." So I went and I gave her black hair and brown skin, and I brought the picture back to my mother, and she said, "Oh, she's beautiful. She looks like you. She's beautiful." And I know that what she was doing in that exercise was she was trying to get me to not just see black things as beautiful, but that when I colored, when I imagined, when I read books, to filter things through that idea and not filter everything I saw through this standard of Eurocentric whiteness that gets perpetuated over and over and over again. So, and in that way, she's also not trying to say, white is ugly, right? But she's trying to get me to see the beauty within blackness. So, and those things stick with you as a child, especially when you think your parents are supposed to praise every act that you do. It was the first time that my mother told me something I made was not great. So, it had a really profound impact on me.
That's interesting. And, I've been dealing with that, and my wife and I have been dealing with that with our chocolate daughter, and just making sure that she's affirmed. And, I think, it's something that I try to. I have a lot of friends of European descent, and, I try to educate them through my Facebook page about some of the things that African-American people have to deal with that they don't even think about, that they don't have to think about. And one of them is the fact that subconsciously and subliminally, the whole concept that white is beautiful is just pervasive in America. And as little kids, there's been that study where they showed little African-American kids a Euro doll and an Afro doll, and they asked which one of these dolls is beautiful, and all the kids chose the Euro doll. And it's because that's the image that they see, from a even from a religious standpoint, from a European Jesus to Santa Claus to Superman to every superhero, every revered figure in our culture is Euro. And that subconsciously...
Or every place of authority, every boss, every employer, every CEO, every principal, every teacher, that has a huge impact. Every police officer, right? So all those things, the way you understand authority or the way you understand power is often seen through whiteness. So, that has a huge impact.
Yes, and so as African Americans, we have to be proactive, and like your mother was, and like you said, I know your mother used an extreme example by saying that doll was ugly, but that's not what she was getting at. Your mother, in the same way that my wife and I, we make sure that we are proactively buying literature with African American characters that are the lead, and reaffirm our daughter in the beauty in her skin and her hair and all these different things. So,
and thankfully that's getting a lot easier to do as well. I think over the past few years we've gotten a lot of really good children's literature that addresses these issues and places little black boys and little black girls at the center of the story, and it's really great to have things like that you can present to your children. Anyway, my son's young as well, and so having books like that to show him books about black pilots or books about, black engineers is really exciting for me to be able to read those stories.
Absolutely. And it's getting better just in the media as well. I noticed that more African Americans are, have positions in the media or in commercials. Like I always notice it when there's African Americans that are in commercials for, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 large companies. Like I noticed that America is becoming more conscious of that. So I must, speak to that as well, because I do see a shift of trying to show more diversity in the imaging. We have a long way to go, and I know that's one of your specialties in terms of like Hollywood and things like that, but we definitely have a long way to go. But I'm noticing certain things, at least in commercials, but that's for another show in terms of Hollywood, which is something actually at some point I want to get to on Race Haven. But in the interest of time, I want to jump to your professional career, and I'm interested in understanding, and you kind of answered it. I was going to ask, what attracted you to becoming a scholar on the era, the 19th century America, and also transitioning into your work as a scholar in your dissertation at Columbia University. Which I believe that's what you're adapting into your book currently, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, which is currently under review at the University of Pennsylvania Press for our listeners. But I want you to just kind of tell us, one, what attracted you to, go into this field, and ultimately what led you to do your research on this topic, Force and Freedom, as well as, your book.
Sure. So all of this started in undergrad. I originally had started out as an English major, and then I changed to journalism. And then while I was probably the end of my sophomore year, someone had told me about the Ronald E. McNair program, which is an excellent program that's gotten a lot of students of color their Ph.Ds. And it's sort of a mentorship program where you get matched with a mentor who is studying in the field of history or psychology or sociology, and you conduct research, you present your research, you publish your research, and they really prepare you for a Ph.D., for a graduate degree, and for the work that historians and scholars do. So when I got involved with the Ronald E. McNair program, I was assigned to my mentor, Dr. Edna Medford, who is still my advisor to this day. She's fantastic. And she really showed me what historians do. So she took me into the archive, and we went into this room. I'll never forget this moment where we sort of had to put on gloves, and, you had to make sure that you didn't have any sort of pointy objects on you, pencils only, no pens. And they would pull out these folders, the archivists, and we opened them, and in it I saw this letter that was at least 100 and maybe 70 years old. And at the end of the letter, I wasn't sure what it was saying or what it was talking about, but at the end of the letter it was signed, "Affectionately your father, Frederick Douglass." And I was floored, because I realized that I was reading a letter that Frederick Douglass had written to his daughter Rosetta. And, it was mostly small talk. It was nothing heavy or political, but it changed my world. And she said, this is what historians do, right? We go into the archives, we look at the actual documents. And being in that room, holding that letter, had a transformative impact on me. And I was like, oh, I'm all in. This is what scholars do. I'm all in. So I had this, love affair with Frederick Douglass. To this day, he is still one of my favorite all-time historical figures for all that he has. I wrote a paper on him, and that paper led to a thesis, and then that thesis became my writing sample for applications to graduate school. So when I got to Columbia and I started writing, I know I wanted to work on Frederick Douglass. I know I wanted to look at people like John Brown, who's a white abolitionist who employs the use of violence to overthrow slavery. And my advisor, who's also amazing, Eric Proner, said, listen, violence is hot right now. Violence, that's a great topic. You should really think about this more. So I started looking at black abolitionists, people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Henry Highland Garnett, William Parker, Lewis Hayden, William Still, who's known as the father of the Underground Railroad, all of these remarkable people. And one, I noticed something that was not being said, and that was black abolitionists, people who were actively advocating for the end of slavery. African Americans were not put at the center of that within the literature. So every time I read about abolitionists, it would be like William Lloyd Garrison or these white, wealthy philanthropists who thought that slavery was wrong but never really knew what slavery was firsthand. And I said, this can't be right. How is it that all of these, elite, wealthy, white abolitionists are leading this or at the center of this? Surely there are black people who are at the center of this, who are talking about these same issues, who experienced slavery themselves. And sure enough, I'm happy to say that the field of history has really changed, so that now a lot of scholars are looking at black abolitionists and say they were the ones who actually recruited white Americans. They are the ones that actually brought the white allies in. They are the ones who are leading it, who are at the center, who are shaping the conversations and the discussions that are happening around this moment. So I started looking at them, and I started looking at violence, because I thought that, slavery really begins in violence. It ends in violence. The Civil War is the most bloodiest war in all of American history. And how is it that violence can be used as a tool, and how black abolitionists saw violence as a legitimate tool? And what a lot of these black abolitionists do, these black leaders, is they look at the American forefathers and they say, well, look at George Washington and look at Thomas Jefferson and look at all of these people that we call patriots. The American Revolution came through violence. And if we are going to end slavery, it will require a revolution, and revolutions require violence. So, so that's how I look at how does the Civil War come about, right? It's not inevitable. It definitely could have continued. The institution of slavery could have continued for another 100 years. So how do the people who are advocating for its end see?
We lost you. Okay. It appears that Dr. Jackson's call has dropped. We'll see if she joins us back here in just a moment. Hopefully she'll chime back in and realize that we lost her. I just want to speak on, the topic that she was discussing, because I'm really fascinated with that era. Okay, we have her back.
Hello?
All right, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I was about to. Yeah, the call dropped, but and I just want to make a comment, and then you can continue because. Again, you don't know this, but I love history, and I'm really fascinated with that era as well. And PBS did what I thought was a really good special 3-part series on abolitionists, and I watched that, and I felt like it, really, really gave some insights, some deep insights into that era. And one of the things you just said that was striking to me is that, with Frederick Douglass, I know that he consulted with William Lloyd Garrison, and, he was all about the peaceful, religious-based appeal, appealing to people's morals. But then at times he was conflicted, and he felt like what you said, you know what, it's going to take violence. And then he went and had several meetings with John Brown, and he almost went with John Brown on that fateful evening when, you know, him and his militia, you know, were captured, you know, trying to storm.
He supported John Brown. He gave him money. He told him, I can't join you because I think this might be a suicide mission, but
pretty much,
you know, here is money to fund what you're doing. He endorsed him financially. So,
right.
And what a lot of people don't know is that Frederick Douglass does not join John Brown, but Harriet Tubman had every intention of joining him. She said, yes, absolutely. He told Harriet Tubman, you know, John Brown told Harriet Tubman, we need you. I can't do this without you. And she said, I will be there. And the day before the raid, Harriet Tubman falls ill, which is probably a good thing because the raid failed. But but she would have been there. And there were actually several women who were quite instrumental in funding John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And I look at that raid not so much as a failure, but really as a delayed success, because what he does really is the spark that starts the Civil War. Man,
it's so fascinating. Like you said, he was a martyr. You know, he and the people that supported him and went with him on that raid, you know, extremely brave and martyrs. And let me say this too, you know, this is an issue. This kind of speaks to an issue that I have a lot of times in the racial discourse in this country, is that, and it's also a problem that I have with language and our tendency to speak in absolutes, even though there's very few. You know, a lot of times I'll hear African American people, you know, talk about, quote, white people, and how white people are this or white people are that. And the only thing that comes to mind for me is I saw European Americans walking on the front line with Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement. I saw European Americans, you know, who were abolitionists, who, like John Brown, who were willing to give up his life for the lives of Africans. And there were thousands of them. So I think that it's been clever in the way that the powers that be or the media has kind of polarized Africans and Europeans, when the reality is our history is literally mixed with people from all races getting behind issues to free African people. And that's why I think language is so important. And yes, it's cumbersome to speak these things out. It's cumbersome to say a segment of European Americans are racist. A segment of European Americans were pro, you know, slavery and pro segregation and et cetera, et cetera. But there was also a segment of European Americans who were fighting side by side for the freedoms and the equalities, et cetera. And so that's why I always find it interesting when people speak in these absolutes, or when I, you know, watching the media and especially on social media, how these things, you know, are debated. Is so unproductive in so many ways. But you know, I digress.
And
I'm going to do a show on that.
I completely agree. And at least within my classroom, I'm always trying to recover the image and the story and the legacy of and the contributions of white allies, because I think that oftentimes we only see whiteness operating as a hero or as a savior or as someone that comes in and sort of like, you know, swoops up all of the, you know, disaster in one day. But I think that it's informative to talk about people like John Brown, not just because he's leading this rebellion, but because before he even initiated it, he sought out the help of black leadership. He sought out the help of black men and women. And he relied on them. There are 5 African-American men that joined him in his raid of 18. So, you know, these people are deeply committed, not just to the abolition of slavery, but really to the abolition of racism. So there are a lot of abolitionists who think that slavery is wrong, don't really believe that black people are equal to white Americans. And so there's that tension that develops there. You know, I tell my students all the time, there's a difference in being an abolitionist versus being anti-slavery. There are a lot of people who were anti-slavery, a lot of Northerners who were anti-slavery, not necessarily because they thought slavery was wrong, but because they understood how slavery undercut their economic bottom line, that no one would pay them $5 an hour when they had a slave who could do it for life. But that did not mean that the person who was anti-slavery thought that black people were humans or thought that black people should vote, should be treated fairly, should attend the same schools as their children. So these things are really complicated and really nuanced. And so what I try to do within my work is to sort of tease out these stories that have really been buried and tease out these narratives that I think people are unfamiliar with and show them how powerful it is to see black people leading a movement that's centered around them, and equally how powerful is it to see white allies who are supporting these efforts at the risk of their own lives as well.
Right. Wow, this is truly fascinating stuff to me. I want to make one more point about the black abolitionists before my final question, and that is, and just abolitionists in general. One of the biggest motivators for me in doing the various things that I do and some of the visions I have that a lot of people tell me, you know, is idealistic or it's not possible, is the abolitionist movement. Because, you know, again, I understand that most people see it as, you know, I guess they don't really process the depths of that movement and how long it took. It literally started in, I believe, the 1820s when William Lloyd Garrison started that news publication that he started sending out, and maybe the 1820s or 1830s.
1830s, yeah.
Okay, and it lasted all the way into the Civil War, which was 30 plus years later, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And
yes, you are.
That's a long time. To fight. That is a long time to believe and fight for something. And so when people tell
3
me,
decades,
you know,
someone's life, that's someone's life.
That
really
is someone's life, 30 years, especially because of all the pushback and all of the negative reinforcement of the movement and all the reasons why they had, all the reasons that presented itself for them to believe this is not going to happen, but they stuck with it. They stuck with it.
And slavery was getting worse. I mean, in the 1830s, there was a lot of hope to believe that slavery might be abolished because people were experiencing what historians call the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious revival where people believed that Christ was coming back, so you better get your house in order. They were sort of this moral imperative. But by the time you get to the 1850s, which is 20 years later, slavery has expanded westward all the way to Texas. You have the fugitive slave law, which basically says if you are a slave and you run away, that we can go into the north and catch you, and that if we see you, we can deputize a northerner on the spot to help recoup this runaway slave. So it basically meant that the only place that you could run away as a slave was Canada. You know, that was the real true north. So slavery looks bleak. You have the Dred Scott case, which basically says, you know, black men have no rights, which a white man is bound to respect. So in a lot of ways, it's very difficult for abolitionists who are living within that moment to find hope, to think that the end is sort of nigh. But in a lot of ways, I think it's also encouraging for us today when we have things like the Black Lives Matter movement or even the Civil Rights movement, and we think that change is inevitable or we think that change should come quickly, and we don't realize that for the real formative change, it takes struggle. It requires constant activism and really years and years of going at that in order to bring about substantive change. So, I commend them. I mean, when I think about the abolitionists, I ask myself, like, could I have been one? You know, like, could I have sort of put myself on the line like that? I've been watching Underground lately. I don't know if you've watched it. It's an amazing show about slaves who are attempting to run away. And I ask myself all the time, could I have done that? You know, could I have been in Georgia and ran 1,000 miles to freedom, like against all odds. I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know.
Right.
I think it's
Right.
really, really difficult to sort of assess where our capacity lies to be able to accomplish these feats.
You know, there's this. I'm loving this dialogue. There's so many directions that I want to go, so many questions I want to ask, but we're up against the time, our time. So, you know, I want to be respectful of your time today. So I just say I hope we get a chance to do this again. But
definitely, once the book is out, we have to speak. We have to speak again. That is for sure.
Absolutely. So I want to ask this last question: how do you see your work as being relevant to the struggle of today? How does it support the work that is being done? You know, we have terms like, you know, white privilege and systemic racism that are now in the mainstream, and it's the consciousness of America is being challenged, which I believe is a good thing, even though it's making a lot of people uncomfortable. But I believe if they dig deep and they listen and they read, and I'm one of those people. Again, I have a lot of friends of European descent, but I'm pushing this information out there not to make them feel uncomfortable, but to hope with the hopes that they'll, you know, trust me and educate themselves and expand their hearts and minds. So I want to know, you know, how does your work contribute to the struggle of today with helping us to, you know, transcend, you know, race-based issues in America?
Well, you know, one of the quotes that I use in my book is actually a 20th century quote. It's by Martin Luther King Jr. Because I look at violence, he says, so appropriately, he says, "A riot is the language of the unheard." A riot is the language of the unheard. And I think that within all of American history, but also within this moment that we're living in right now, violence has just been the theme of the day, whether we're looking at Trump rallies, whether we're looking at police brutality against black bodies, whether we're looking at what's going on in the rest of the world, whether it be in, you know, places like Syria and Turkey, or places in Africa that are also experiencing enormous amounts of violence and terrorism. I think that we really have to understand not so much the riot or the mob or the act, but what is at the root of this? Why do people feel as though they are being unheard? And what is the message that they are trying to convey? And I think that when it comes to Black Americans in particular, this constant message of really trying to get the world to understand that Black people are in fact people has been probably one of the most difficult messages since the inception of American slavery, trying to get people to understand that we are fathers, we are husbands, we are daughters, we are brothers, you know, that we bleed, that we live, that we love. I think it's been at the center of the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, Black Lives Matter is a way of saying we are human and we matter, right? Not more than anyone else, not at the expense of anyone else, but that we exist and we matter. And so that's really what I'm trying to do with my work, albeit, you know, 150 years earlier. But I think if we were to look at any movement that's been successful, the abolitionist movement, for me, is the foundation for how all other movements have really based their strategy and their ideas and their goals.
Absolutely. And just one point that comes to mind for me and what you were just saying is also that if we're telling you as African American people, if we're telling you that we're hurting, why are you pushing back instead of asking, how can we help? That's like the biggest question I've had in my mind, because I it's exactly what you're saying, and people have a hard time grasping that humanity. You know, if you truly love someone and you care about them, even if you don't understand why they're hurting, you want to you want to get to the bottom of it to help them feel better. But in America, there's this psychosis that African people are just complaining, they're victim mentality, making excuses. But it's like, hey, we're telling you that we're hurting. We're telling you we're hurting. And again, if I was your family member or your friend or someone you loved, and they said, I'm hurting, I don't, you know, you may not understand why, it's something internal, but I'm hurting, can you get me some help? You know, your instant response to someone that you see as human or equal is, how can I help? And that's the rub today, and that's what you just articulated, and that's kind of what comes to mind for me. So with all that said, again, I want to say, for our listeners, that's our time for today. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to give a special thank you to our guest, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson.
Thank you.
Kellie,
thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners how they can connect with you and your work. If there's any way that they can learn more about you and your work.
I post everything on my website, so it's just KellieCarterJackson.com. But Kellie with an I-E. That's really important. My mom had to make me different. So Kellie with an I-E, KellieCarterJackson.com. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just K Carter Jackson, at K Carter Jackson. But you can also go to the Hunter website. I'm there as well at Hunter College in the History Department.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I want to tell you to have a great day before I close out the remainder of the show.
You do the same.
And I cannot wait till we get a chance to do this again. You have a great day.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right, awesome. So for our listeners, please be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven radio show and podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio so that you never miss the dialogue. If you love this show, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher podcast apps. This will help the show gain more visibility and listeners. We're creating some awesome content that will help people understand things on a deeper level. So please share, please leave reviews if you're enjoying the content of this episode and others. In addition to that, we want to hear from you. So please visit racehavenblog.com and leave comments and questions about today's show. Both Dr. Kellie and I will be monitoring the site. And if anyone has a question or a comment about today's show, you can leave it at this. You can find this episode at racehavenblog.com and click comments. You can also join our online community by joining the Race Haven Facebook group. And if today's episode resonated with you, please share the podcast link on social media and with your friends. Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Peace.
This episode of Race Haven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app. 5 for Friends is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks? Because you both were so busy? Do you put off calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then 5 for Friends is the solution. It's a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends, 5 minutes at a time. Visit 5forfriends.com or your app store to download. It's the number 5, F-O-R, Friends. Try it today.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven radio show and podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.